President, I want to follow up on the very important remarks made by our colleague, Senator Murray, because I really, as a result of the debate that we've had in Washington, D.C., knew that there was a significant, problem. But until we held these forums across our state, and we essentially went into every corner of Oregon, it really didn't come home to me how serious a problem this is. And for a minute or two, I want to highlight this point I got into with Senator Murray with respect, to rural areas. Some of the stories, for example, that I was told, for example, about a woman in Central Oregon who essentially faced with an abuse, a very abusive relationship, spent the evening trying to hide out in ditches in the community. And she would just run from ditch to ditch. And of course, you get pretty banged up and bruised when you do something like that. But she hid out in ditches through the night in order to avoid her abuser. But then it comes to morning time, and she wants to get out. She wants to get to the safety net programs, a wonderful shelter in her area. But the fact was the only way to get out was to ask for a ride from the one person who had a vehicle in the community, and that was the person who abused her in the first place. So literally, in a rural community, and I heard this account just recently, she had nowhere to turn. And that's why I characterize the Violence Against Women program as really, especially for rural women, the last line of defense between them and the abuser. And finally, in one community, I know my colleague will identify with this because I enjoyed going to West Virginia and the like, in a rural community in the eastern part of our state, it was described to me that there was no transportation out of the community, no transportation at all. And the woman involved was going to literally have to stay there and face continual abuse. And finally, the one vehicle in the community was a fishing shuttle. I'm sure the senator from West Virginia identifies with that because it's something we have in our rural communities, a vehicle that takes folks fishing. And the fishing shuttle said, the owner of it, he said, I'm going to be the one to take this woman to safety. I don't need to be reimbursed. I don't need to have some kind of government program or something. I'm going to do it because it's right. And that's how that woman in a rural community escaped her abuser. She got out. She got free. She was able to shake out of the clutches of the abuser because the fellow who owned the fishing shuttle stuck up for her. But, Mr. President, I think this is Senator Murray's point. I don't think we can accept that all across the country that we're going to have fishing shuttles available in order to rescue women who are subject to this kind of abuse. I think that's pretty far-fetched, and the good hearts of Oregonians came through in that particular situation. But we've got to reenact this program. And the fact is, Mr. President and colleagues, this has been the law of the land for more than a decade. There has not been a shred of partisanship, in it. It's not about ideology. It's about protecting women, from brutality. And I had thought, frankly, Mr. President, that we had gotten over some of the arguments against this legislation that had been trotted out in the past. For example, it was often said in the past, well, maybe these abuse cases really aren't abuse. Maybe they're just kind of family matters. They're going to get settled when family kind of calms down and maybe somebody got upset about something, and then in a day or so, everything is going to go back to normal. That's not the case, Mr. President. This is about repeated instances of violence. Repeated instances of violence you can't just slough off as a family member, as a family difference of opinion. It's crime. It's brutal violence. And that's why we need this legislation. and we need it, reauthorized. I think it's also especially important, Mr. President, given some of the budget cuts that we have seen that are particularly hitting small communities like a wrecking ball. For example, in Josephine County, a rural part of our state, they're in the position, Mr. President, where when a subpoena goes out, they essentially don't have the resources to follow it up. In other words, the subpoena is used to, in effect, set in motion the law enforcement, process, bring the abuser, to justice. And I was told by the key law enforcement officials in Josephine County in a community forum that I held in Medford, Oregon, for folks from the southwestern part of the state, that they really, literally didn't have the resources to follow up on how to ensure that that abuser was brought to justice. Now, Mr. President, I'd make just a couple of additional points. I see colleagues on the floor waiting to speak, but I also want to talk about the costs that are associated with this. You have two kinds of costs. First, you have direct health care costs that stem from the violence that you see perpetrated against women. And then also you have costs in terms of lost productivity. At a time when we are getting hit very hard by unemployment, and we know we're in a productivity race with Asia and India and China and other countries, we can't afford the costs, the healthcare costs of violence against women that ends up having women land in hospital emergency rooms and the like, nor can we allow this lost productivity at a time when we are pushing so hard to create more good paying jobs. And the protection that's offered through the Violence Against Women Act saves my home state of Oregon now millions of dollars through its key provisions. Safety from domestic violence would save Oregon more than $35 million per year in direct health care costs. Our state loses approximately $9.3 million per year in lost productivity from paid work as a result of domestic violence. And the fact is, the preventive services offered by the Violence Against Women Act saves money, as does the very important work that's done by victim services. A study of 278 victims in my hometown of Portland who received domestic violence and housing assistance found that those services resulted in more than $610,000 in savings during the first 6 months. So there's savings in terms of assistance, whether it's housing or counseling. Emergency medical care utilization is reduced as a result of emergency services, safety net services being available. And whether it's one measure or another, Mr. President, from a financial standpoint, reauthorizing the Violence Against Women legislation makes sense. But at the end of the day, while the financial savings are substantial, Mr. President, it seems to me the Violence Against Women Act is about restoring dignity to women who've been abused in our country. No woman in the United States should be subject to the kind of physical abuse that I've documented in cases coming from Oregon that Senator Murray has described this afternoon. They strip our people, women in this country, of their dignity and their confidence and their ability, after they shake free from their abuser, to get on and have the kind of productive life that they want for themselves and their family. So, Mr. President, ultimately, this is about dignity. It's about doing what's right. This legislation has been on the books for more than a decade. There is no reason, none whatever, Mr. President, that this legislation isn't passed overwhelmingly on a bipartisan, bicameral basis. And I'm going to do everything I can, Mr. President, here on the floor of the Senate, talking with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make sure that this legislation is reauthorized, because what I saw during these community forums in my home state from small towns across Oregon shouldn't happen in my state. It shouldn't happen anywhere, because it is not right, and the Senate can take action to stop it. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.